Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be in this world, and welcome to another edition of the Australia-India Conversations. Today, we're joined by a special guest, Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, who in his previous life was Secretary East for the Ministry of External Affairs, and most recently was the author of the Australia Economic Strategy, which was released by the Government of India late last year. We are joined by Ambassador Wadhwa to discuss the historic agreement that was signed yesterday by Australia and India, the India-Australia Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement, otherwise known as IndAus ECTA. Welcome, Ambassador Wadhwa, and thank you for joining us today. What an exciting time it is to be in the Australia-India space, a historic moment for both countries and for people like yourselves and I who have been involved in this Australia-India space for decades. How do you feel now that the interim FTA or CETA has been signed?
I think it's a very good feeling. It was, very much expected in the past, but the negotiations could not be concluded earlier, and we have seriously been contemplating this agreement since 2013, as you know. We had a phase where we came pretty close to this agreement, but it was unfortunately put on the back burner in 2015 or so. And then once again, the negotiations have been revived, and I'm very happy that we've been able to, with the help of the leadership of both countries, the prime ministers and also the trade ministers, been able to reach a conclusion on this agreement. Quite frankly, it's a win-win agreement for both sides, as I see it. It's very much in line with the recommendations of the economic strategies of the two countries. If you recall, Dipen, during our conversation earlier on the Australia Economic Strategy report, I said that it would be a big help if we could reach such an agreement, because then we would have reduced tariffs on across the board on a number of items that we trade with each other, and we'll be able to liberalize our services in a manner that will benefit both economies. And that's exactly what has happened in this interim agreement. And by the way, I would not call it an interim agreement because it's quite a wide-ranging, comprehensive agreement. Of course, there are some challenging issues which have been left out for the future. But still, it covers a majority of our bilateral trade. It also covers a majority of the services sector where we both have interest. And that's why I would say that this is a first trade agreement, which would benefit corporates from both sides. And I think it would spur much greater attention to each other.
As we have sort of discussed earlier, and you have just mentioned, it's not a fully fledged, comprehensive economic agreement. But what do you think we'll come into? We'll discuss the tariffs that have been reduced on 85% of the goods in this agreement that was signed yesterday. But I just want to ask you what you feel that, are there any other commitments that do you think both governments and both sides should make to have a fully fledged CETA become reality by the end of the year, apart from the 85% that has happened? And of course, there's a few areas that will sort of take provision within the next 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, so I think there's a big effort which has been made, in this agreement itself to cover most of the bilateral trade and services. Now, over 96.4% of Indian goods were valued and 98% by tariff lines. will get zero duty access on day one of the pact, when it comes into force. And the rest is set for phased concessions. And there will be immediate nil duty on 85%, as you said, of Australian exports on the first day, and no to low duty on 30.3% tariff lines in the next 3 to 10 years. I think the big gain here is that India will gain from the duty-free access for a host of labor-intensive sectors, and that includes things like textiles and garments, gems and jewelry, leather and footwear, furniture, food and farm products, some engineering products, medical devices, and also automobiles. And very importantly, it's been agreed to have a separate chapter on pharmaceutical products under this agreement, which will then expedite the approval for patented, for generic, and biosimilar medicines. We also have a liberalized visa regime, which has been attempted. Again, something that was recommended in the Australia Economic Strategy report, and I'm very glad to see it here. This will allow easier movement of professionals. Now, of course, from the Indian point of view, there are some sensitive sectors, which you all know. That includes dairy, like sunflower oil, wheat, rice, sugar, some nuts like walnuts, apples, pulses, oil seeds, beef. Now, these have been kept out of the agreement, but further down the line, I think when we are much more confident of trade with each other and the Indian economy is much stronger, then of course, we will have to look at these issues as well. I think Australian wines have done well to get the concessions. And this is a big breakthrough. No other country in the world has got concessions on wine so far with India. And Australian wines will see a reduced duty from 150% to 25% over a period of 10 years in two categories. So that takes care of the Indian domestic wine industry as well. Now, specifically, what will happen that Australian wine that costs between $5 and $15 per 750 ml will get a concessional duty of 100% initially from the current 150%. And then the tariff will be cut by 500 basis points annually for 10 years, and finally kept at 50%. Similarly, the import duty on wines beyond $15 per 750 ml will be reduced to 75% immediately. It will then be cut by 500 basis points annually for 10 years to be kept at 25%. That's a win-win, I think, for both sides again. In certain cases, there are quantitative caps as well, and India has specifically insisted on that because of the sensitive nature of the agriculture situation here, as you know. But still, India will allow long staple cotton at zero duty, and that's subject to a cap. That is 300,000 bales, which is, of course, less than 1% of its annual domestic consumption. But it could go up, in the future. And that's something that, both sides will concentrate on. Then duty-free access has been provided to 1% of a certain variety of Australian cotton. And you have Australian fruit like oranges and mandarin, which will get preferential access, but only up to a cap of 13,000 tons. That, again, is something which can go up quite easily in the future. Right now, Australian coal attracts 2.5% duty, but now it'll enjoy duty-free access. And I think that makes up around 70%, 67 to 70% of Australian exports. So that's a big gain for Australia. Again, you have Australian fish, lobsters, crayfish, etc. Things like macadamia nuts, critical minerals, lamb, wool, metallic ores. These will all benefit from reduction of duty, and you also have a liberalization of the services sector. Now these are not few, because if you look at from the Indian point of view, there are 135 subsectors where you have MFN status, and then you have 120 subsectors where you have market access, enhanced access for India. Similarly, market access has been given to Australia in 103 subsectors, and MFN status in 31 subsectors. Remember, there are these 11 broad categories of services. which encourage flow of professionals. And so this is not a small number at all. I think both sides will later on look at how to liberalize the services sector much further, because services sector between India and Australia is growing very, very rapidly. So there are these gaps which have been left out for the future, and I'm sure both sides will look at it very seriously. Of course, over the next 12 months, as the ministers have said, you will also need some important reciprocal arrangements, especially in the services sector. And they'll be looking very aggressively, they said, on mutual recognition of professional services and other licensed or regulated occupations. Also, we've started off with the work and holiday visa arrangements for young students from India, but that's been limited by Australia to about 1,800 per year. That can easily go up again. So there is a lot of scope in this agreement, but essentially, in my view, it touches upon the most important segments and the most important aspects of bilateral trade and services, and that can be improved further.
Mm-hmm. Amazing insights into the sectors and what the opportunities are for both countries. Australia sells an awful lot of coking coal, for example, to India. I think 70+% of India's coking coal requirements are from Australia. Coking coal is predominantly used for steel production. Was there any mention of Indian steel being sold into Australia or steel or iron products? So what I'm trying to say is that steel is one, but when you look at gems and jewelry, gold and so on, if there's value add put in India and then produced in India, manufactured in India, and then sold back to Australia, I'd like to understand if there's an opportunity for us Indian steel producers to sell steel into Australia as part of this agreement.
Well, absolutely, and I think what will happen in the future, because of the coal prices having come down and the utilization primarily of DRI technology in Australia and the steel industry, you will have more and more Australian companies looking at India as a manufacturing base, possibly through joint ventures and taking the produce to third countries like Japan, for instance, or taking it back to Australia. Steel consumption in Australia, of course, is limited given the smaller population in Australia, 24 million people. But there are other markets in the region. And I think Australian manufacturers will need to look at this very closely now, because this market will provide them with labor-intensive, cheaper alternative for production and then re-exports to third countries. So from that perspective, again, this opens up a very good possibility. And I'm very happy to see that the duty on coal has been eliminated totally, because this will give great incentives to Australian and Indians, both who are engaged with each other in this field.
You talked a little bit about some of the areas that India has not opened up, some of the sectors. What were some of the sectors that Australia didn't want to open up or haven't opened up in this agreement?
So I think the most important sectors are in the services segment, where you have again certain categories that have been kept back because it's important for Australia to make sure that its own talent is utilized first before we go on to get imported workers and professionals from other countries. As I said, you have now 135 subsectors, but the MFN has been provided for only 120 subsectors. So that means you have a whole lot of other subsectors which are still not fully open. Obviously, from the Indian perspective, because of the surplus of population that India has, it has more services to export. And as we go along again, I think if you look at, for example, yoga teachers, now they can enter Australia only as contractual service suppliers. So temporary entry and stay is now permissible for a period up to 4 years. But possibly this could be extended further if there is seen to be a demand which grows in the Australian market. Of course, the possibility of further stay has been kept open in the agreement, which is once again very futuristic. I think it's good thinking on both sides. Um, Post-study work visas. Now, that is for 2 to 4 years. That will be available for postgraduates and STEM students from India and specialists. Now, of course, you have more than 100,000 Indian students who are enrolled in various courses in Australia. The way I see it, I can only see this number grow in the future because education is a major thrust area for Australia into India. So recruitment of Indian students into Australian institutions and universities will grow in the future, and there will be an aggressive, drive by Australian universities now to also make use of the new education policy in India. So I see a lot of synergy in the education sector. But what happens to these students who actually finish off from Australian universities? And if they can be absorbed and there's a need for them in the Australian job market, then of course they would be looking for that opportunity. So there again, we have to give further thought to how this can be brought about in the future. So I'm saying that not everything is opened up. There are certain sectors that will be opened up gradually as we move along with this agreement. And we'll have to see how the results show up, particularly over the next 1 or 2 years.
With regards to the services sector in particular, there were some talks about the double tax treaty. Can you enlighten us on what the discussions were and where they ended up?
So look, this is something which was discussed, but that's something which has to be taken up outside the purview of this particular agreement, because that's an arrangement that both sides have to enter with the ministries of finance on both sides and financial authorities. It's essentially about countries who are making use of their services from their subsidiaries, and this applies mainly to Indian companies who are working in Australia in the IT field in particular. If a company, for instance, is utilizing services from its subsidiary in Philippines or in Canada, for instance, into Australia, then the company is being taxed in both countries. It's being taxed in Philippines, it's been taxed in Canada, it's been taxed in Australia. But the idea is to simplify this to say that they should then not be taxed in Australia. And similarly, India will not tax Australian companies in India. But that again requires an arrangement between the financial authorities and will have to be taken up for discussions. Now, there is a chapter which we see in this particular treaty, for instance, on trade remedies. And there's also a chapter on temporary movement of natural persons. So, issues like this can be discussed under these heads. But when the professionals of the ministry is concerned meet directly, it could be a faster process.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So, post signing the agreement and then heading to a fully fledged agreement at the end of the year, what do you think are the geostrategic and geoeconomic implications for India moving forward?
So I think, as I've been saying earlier, Dipen, India has emerged as a strategic partner, ideal strategic partner for Australia, because it is now engaged in overcoming the challenges it has of rapid urbanization and infrastructure development. So what it does require is resources like clean water, like digital connectivity, health amenities for its growing and a very aspirational population. So we see that there are some excellent prospects for collaboration between India and Australia in some critical areas. That, of course, is mainly science, but also now vaccines, pandemic management, new areas like space and defense, which have opened up. We always talked about critical minerals and related technologies, water resources, training and education. And now we have the circular economy, the waste to wealth processes, grains management and logistics, and cyber technology. Now, I've named these particular ones because they are the most important and critical for both countries. On the other hand, we also seen that India needs Australian commodities like lithium, cobalt, vanadium, rare earths, coal, and LNG. All this is required for its development. It also requires technology to solve problems such as financial inclusion and healthcare and education jointly with Australia. I pointed this out in the Australia Economic Strategy report that Australia has 21 of the 49 minerals which have been identified as critical for India's future strategy, especially its e-mobility program. And then again, we have the new economic policy of education policy of India, which has opened up possibilities of Australian companies coming into India and opening campuses, for instance. There are new possibilities of defense and space sectors where India has a technology pool which is complementary to Australian requirements. Excuse me. So we also have Australian super funds which are looking at infrastructure in India. And so all this presents a very important opportunity for both sides.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador Wadhwa. Would you like to take a glass of water quickly? You're okay?
For me, yeah.
India over the last probably 6-7 years has been quite hesitant in signing free trade agreements and so on. Recently, it's signed one with the UAE, it's in discussions with UK, and now this agreement has been signed with Australia. How do you see this shaping international perception on India's trade engagement and global economic integration going forward?
So I think it's a very important agreement from that perspective. India just recently signed, like you said, an agreement with the UAE, which is also quite comprehensive, quite far-reaching. There is also a new Middle East Accord which has emerged. Geopolitically, the agreement with UAE would pave the way for a similar agreement possibly with Israel in the near future as far as India is concerned. And this agreement with Australia then opens up some very important possibilities of companies taking advantage of the agreements that India has with UAE and with Israel from Australia, for instance. And again, Indian companies who want to take advantage of the three markets together. And of course, the United States is an important partner of the Middle East Accord. But we must remember that India is also talking on a GCC-wide free trade agreement. It is also discussing a free trade agreement with Canada, for instance, the United Kingdom, with which Australia has enormous amount of trade and investments, and a few other agreements down the road, which will make it very important for companies to be aware of the possibilities that they have on a wider network, on a much wider scale. And that's why this agreement, with all the new innovations it has brought in, And I can see from the chapters here that it has things like, besides goods and services, it has, of course, sanitary and phytosanitary measures and rules of origin, which are normal. But it also has trade facilitation and customs procedures. It has legal and institutional issues, the technical barriers to trade chapter, also dispute settlement. And I mentioned earlier the movement of natural persons, trade remedies, which is very important again, and again, specific areas which are of interest to both sides in the services sector. So there you have financial services, telecom equipment, you have the other kinds of services which normally you don't find in such detail in agreements of this sort. So going forward, we will see that these are of immense value to both sides in fleshing out the details and implementation. But as implementation takes place, if you have specific agreements already in place, it helps in reciprocal arrangements that can be entered into fairly quickly. So that's why it's a new generation kind of agreement, and it builds upon all the past experiences. I understand that as far as Australia is concerned, it is not, it does not reach the same level of liberalization that Australia has in certain other countries. But given the status of the Indian market and the Indian economy, and the huge market, in fact, which India has, I think Australia will benefit a lot from this agreement as well, despite the fact that, the threshold has been kept a little low for Australia by way of ambition. But going forward, we will see much better utilization of this agreement.
But talking about reciprocation, during the Prime Minister's virtual summit, the second one that was held last week, Scott Morrison announced $280 million funding to improve relations with India, and set out a number of initiatives within that. And also in the budget, the federal budget that was released only a few days ago, there was close to $245 million allocated to the implementation of the updated India economic strategy and other initiatives. Does the Indian government have, or have they indicated that they would be spending any funds to reciprocate and to build, for example, on your Australia economic strategy?
Dipen, we don't have any specifics announced. I think the reason is that this is the Australia Economic Strategy report was a CII report, as you know, and it has the support of the government. But at the same time, the implementation part, the burden will fall on CII going forward. There have been conversations on this in the past, and this is the mechanism that will be adapted in India. So obviously, whatever needs to be spent will be determined by way of grants between the government and the CII, and not announced as a government spending on either the report or on its implementation. So we will not have that kind of figure, but it's not as if the government is not aware that the word needs to be spread on the report, the opportunities. And now, of course, this Australia-India or India-Australia ECTA, which has come about. This will also need to be made widely known amongst the business community and the opportunities that it offers. And quite frankly, I think the agreement explains itself, because it's a very clear agreement in my view, with clear chapters. And when somebody takes the trouble of reading it, they will know quite clearly that a majority of Indian exports are now enjoying, almost 96% of them are enjoying 0% tariffs from day one. And that's a big win for Indian companies.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so So I just want to stick with your CII report, the one you authored. How do you see the AES report turning into solid business outcomes now after the agreement has been signed?
So I think, this is not the end of the story because as the Minister Piyush Goyal pointed out, that we will be very aggressively looking to conclude bilateral arrangements in specific sectors, especially in services. And at the same time, there are a number of working groups that exist between India and Australia, like the Grains Partnership, for instance, the critical minerals partnership that has been announced in the past, the MOU that has been signed between Camil and for investments with Australian entities into Australia or in the critical mineral sector. So all these will require to be activated fairly quickly if we have to achieve success of what we have agreed on paper. And the Indian companies and the Australian companies will have to examine this agreement to see where they can make they can make gains out of the agreement, because once it comes into force, which will be very quickly, once the Parliament in Australia has ratified and we have our presidential assent. I think the system is fairly simplified in the Indian case. And of course, in Australia, will have to wait for the elections to be over and new parliament to be in place. So possibly another 4 months, I would say at least. And after that, the agreement would be ready to go. But that doesn't mean that the business community and the organizations that are involved should let up. I mean, they should essentially prepare themselves, use this opportunity to disseminate information about what the agreement has to offer, and also try and build upon it for a much bigger agreement, comprehensive agreement within the year, as the ministers have already agreed. So that aim should not be lost sight of.
Mm-hmm. And from your personal perspective, what would you wish to see from here onwards, going forward with bilateral ties between the two countries? What are your thoughts on how it should go forward?
I think now that the pandemic seems to be behind us, at least for the time being, there should be more business travel between the two countries. That's a gap which exists because of the pandemic. For the last 2 years, there have been a number of contacts made, but virtually. But there's no substitute to face-to-face meetings. The businessmen from both sides should start traveling and meeting their counterparts. There should be more specialized delegations, in my view, not diffused, combined delegations where everything is talked about under the sun, because there is no substitute for talking specifically about products in which both sides are interested. And these could be smaller delegations, but very focused delegations. And that is the kind of effort which will yield results.
Fantastic. On that note, thank you so much, Ambassador Wadhwa, for joining us today and providing your thoughts and views on the IndAus ECTA. And we look forward to speaking with you in the future. And thank you for all the work that you put in for the AES and to make this agreement possible. All the very best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dipen. Pleasure.
Let me